With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
And welcome into the program, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us here on Tactics, whether you're watching on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter or Twitch or Periscope or the terrestrial signal, or on my website, or on SoundCloud. However you're listening to us, we appreciate you being with us. I know I have like 80 different ways to listen to the show now, so if you're not listening to the show, you have no excuse. Although, if you're not listening to the show, then you also didn't hear me say that, so kind of a catch-22. Anyway, regardless of all of that nonsense, thank you so much for being with us here on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. And we are going to definitely be hitting that last line pretty heavy in this episode of Tactics. Thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to make us a part of your day. And right now I am getting ready to take off to the Ukraine. I'm going to be gone all next week, so I do apologize that I won't be able to give any political commentary. There's not going to be a show next week, so you'll just have to wait until the week after for Tactics to return to its regularly scheduled programming. And to be honest, I kind of doubt that I'm going to be able to do Monday and maybe even Tuesday after that, just because if you've ever done any transatlantic traveling, the jet lag is murder. Like, it seriously takes 2 or 3 days to actually get back on track, and I think I'm going to be doing good to do one job, let alone two, by the time that I get back. It's going to take me a little time to rest up, but rest assured, I love doing this show so much, and I am going to be very eager to tell you about my trip, so I will be back on the air as soon as humanly possible. And just so you know, while I'm over there, I intend to start looking around for DNC servers, try to talk to President Zelensky if I can. Like, I'm not going to just be lagging around. I'm going to be doing mission work and also, maybe a little undercover reporting. I don't know, maybe try to do that. I mean, I'm going to be over there anyway, so why not? The thing is, I won't be able to do much of that anyway. I'll only be in Kyiv for probably, a few hours before I hop the train to Ivano-Frankivsk, so even if I wanted to do that, I really won't have time to do it, but I don't know, it's kind of fun to think about. It's like maybe I go over there and get some kind of secret interview that winds up breaking this whole thing out with Joe Biden and Donald Trump. I'd love to do that. I just don't think that I'm going to have either the time or the resources to be able to pull that off. But nonetheless, if I happen to see a giant computer server marked DNC, I'm grabbing that thing. I'll tell you that right now. I just think the odds of that are pretty low. Anyway, so I am getting ready to do that, and I would very much appreciate your prayers and thoughts going my way for me and my colleagues that are going over there. I know that one day, I think Monday, we're going to a very, very remote village, and it's going to take us, it's basically going to be an all-day trip. So one of the days that we're going over there, we're going to be going into some very remote parts of the country, and so we definitely need some help with that. But from what we've heard, there's people there eager to hear the gospel, and we're certainly willing to go there, no matter what kind of effort it takes on our part, if there are people that are willing to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. So we're really excited about that, hoping to start a church in that town. But we've got a lot to talk about, and since we have spoken last, there has been a fascinating development in Montgomery. There is, for the first time ever, a black mayor of the capital of the state of Alabama. That's right here in the capital city, Montgomery, Alabama, home of the march from Selma to Montgomery, home of the Montgomery bus boycotts. We have the first black mayor in Stephen Reed. Now, I'm not somebody that gets all up on the intersectionality thing, and frankly, I wasn't a big fan of Stephen Reed. And by that, I don't mean I thought Wood should have won. I meant I didn't really care for either one of them. And that's part of the reason that you didn't hear me talk a whole lot about that, partly because Kevin Elkins, my cohort, that comes on the morning show during 1440, he handles most of the local stuff and I handle most of the state stuff. That's kind of a unspoken agreement between us that typically when something's going on in the state, I'm the one covering it. And when something's going on in the city, he covers it. So, that's not something that I'm restricted by. It's just usually I let him handle that because he's better suited for it. But nonetheless, I have been paying attention to it, and Stephen Reed, regardless of whether I agree with some of his policies or his politics, it is pretty cool that in Montgomery, which is sort of the heart and the birthplace of the civil rights movement, that we have a black mayor. That's pretty cool. I mean, don't get me wrong. That's a really interesting development that has come about, and regardless of whether I like the guy or don't like the guy, it is a momentum event that has taken place. And I said the same thing about President Barack Obama. Didn't like Obama very much, completely disagreed with his policies. But when he got elected, I was like, you know what? It is pretty cool that we have a black president. I mean, I'd 10 times rather have a black president that I actually agreed with and thought would be good at the job, but it is cool that if nothing else, that America is a place where it doesn't matter what color you are, it doesn't matter what your background is, that you can come to this country, and as long as you are a natural-born citizen, become the president of that country. And in the city, you don't even have to be naturally born in Montgomery, but of course you can be. But that's just a really neat thing, and I did want to talk about that just a little bit. One other thing before we get into some really serious news that I do think is urgent that we need to talk about. I do have some uplifting news before we get into some of the more serious stuff, which is I saw this really, really interesting, since we're talking about presidents and Barack Obama just a second ago, this really fascinating story about President Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter had a fall the other day. He is the oldest living president. He's 94. Yeah, I believe he's 94 now. And he fell the other day, and apparently it was not enough to stop him. As we all know, he is really involved in the Habitat for Humanity, building homes for the less fortunate, making sure that they have a place to live, a place to stay, and a place to raise their family, which, I mean, is a great charity, and I appreciate all the work that President Carter does in it. And he does a lot of the work himself, which is evidenced by this. Now look at Jimmy Carter. You can tell he's got the bandage on. You can tell that he has the black eye from when he fell the other day. And there he is, man, going to town with what appears to be a nail gun. I want to say that that's like an air pressure powered nail gun. But anyway, regardless of what it is, there's Jimmy Carter. Here's another one that's really good of Jimmy Carter. This is Jimmy Carter working again from the angle, and you can really see how prominent that black eye is. Not sure what he's doing there, but Jimmy Carter. And here's the thing about it. Jimmy Carter was by no means a great president. I think that he was pretty awful in terms of politics. But you have to admire the man's spirit. I mean, here's Jimmy Carter, former president, would never have to do any manual labor for the rest of his life if he didn't want to. And especially after he's long past not only retirement age, but the average lifespan of a American man. And just going to town on some construction work for Habitat for Humanity, doing it for a good cause, not even doing it to make gain for himself, and is so dedicated to it that not only has he not stopped at 94, that even when he takes a fall, he's so determined to do it that he's back on the job site. Man, that's inspiring. I sometimes have a hard time motivating myself to do things, and when you see something like that, you just got to think, I really do need to make it a point to motivate myself, maybe not necessarily in the way that Jimmy Carter does, but to help somebody out every single day. That when I look at myself in the mirror at night before I'm about to pass out and go to bed, I want to see somebody that helped make somebody else's life better at the end of that day. And Jimmy Carter, regardless of what you think of him politically, because politically I don't agree with him very much, but regardless of that, He is an inspiring individual, and he's got a big heart. And come on, that's more than you can say for the vast majority of people. And so, President Carter, we definitely wish you the best. We wish you a quick recovery. And kudos to you for being so dedicated in your service to other people. It's a quality that I hope to emulate. Might emulate it in a different way. But the point is, Jimmy Carter, big-hearted guy, really glad to see that he's doing better and that he is so dedicated to the cause of helping others. Another thing that we've got going on here, this is getting into the really serious news. I don't know how many of you have been paying attention, but the Syrians, it is just not going well over there. Because President Trump has decided that we were going to pull out. We didn't have very many troops left in Syria to begin with, but he decided to pull the troops out of northern Syria, and already it has had disastrous results. And part of this is, and regardless of how you feel about President Trump, regardless of how you feel about being in the Middle East, I'm not necessarily making a judgment call on that so far. I'm going to get into some opinion in a second because that's the point of the show. I'm just reporting facts here for the moment. It wasn't even 48 hours. Heck, I don't even think it was 36 hours before Turkish forces started moving in and attacking the forces in northern Syria and attacking the Kurds. The reason this is so important is that the leader of Turkey, the dictator really of Turkey, is a radical card-carrying member of the Muslim Brotherhood. And just absolutely despises anybody that isn't specifically a Sunni Muslim. And has already been attacking the Kurds, the Yazidis. It took almost no time at all. And here's the thing. A lot of my friends and compatriots over here on the right, you have to, if you're being honest with yourself, admit that if President Obama did exactly the same thing in exactly the same situation, that you would not be happy with it. With just pulling out and making a big deal about it and announcing it. See, to me, it may even be worse, not necessarily that he pulled out completely, but that he announced it and made a big deal about it. To me, that's the worst part, because you're showing your hand and you're basically making a big show of it. And because of that, the Turks, I mean, they saw that as a sign of weakness and it's time to pounce. And a lot of the people over there that are being killed are our Christian brothers and sisters. And let's not forget that pulling out of Iraq and doing so in exactly the same fashion, making a big show out of it, making a spectacle, saying, no, we will be out by this date. We're pulling out no matter what. We're not even going to consider the situation on the ground. The only thing that I care about is getting them home. That's exactly what Barack Obama did, and it led to the rise of ISIS. I mean, directly led to the rise of ISIS. It's not even a conjecture or, maybe this is how it took up. No, we know for a fact that doing so is what allowed ISIS to form and eventually create a caliphate. Now, that caliphate has been pushed back now, which, by the way, Donald Trump deserves a lot of credit for. But this just flat out pulling out of Syria and announcing and showing his hand, telling, to put it in football terms, showing the playbook before he runs the play. That was an incredibly dumb move. And it has put the lives of others into a great deal of peril. A lot of people that are Christian brothers and sisters over there in the Middle East. And a lot of the people that are on the pro pulling out side of this have said, well, it's not right that Americans should have to die for the Kurds. Well, there's a couple of reasons why that's a really bad argument. First of all, the Kurds have been working jointly with American forces, and there have been several Kurds that have died to protect Americans. And the other side of that is that it had been a very long time since any American had died in the defense of anybody over in northern Syria. And the reason for that is it was kind of like having a police presence. It acts as a deterrent. So it's not as though American forces were actively fighting over there, But the mere fact that they were there, the mere fact that they maintained a presence and could retaliate quickly and answer quickly to any threats that came their way, was acting as a deterrent. And the reason that it's very easy to know that that was acting as a deterrent is, like I said, it wasn't even a full 48 hours, not even 2 days later, that the Americans pulled out, that Turkey decided it was time to go ahead and strike. And here's the thing. You don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to listen to the talking heads and the experts on all of our cable news networks, on CNN and MSNBC and Fox and all those. You don't even have to listen to them. Go directly to the Turkish government and the guy that's currently the dictator over there. Like I said, card-carrying member of the Muslim Brotherhood. Take him at his own words. He has said that he wants to take over northern Syria. He has said that he wants to essentially establish the Ottoman Empire. Back when Turkey was controlling the vast majority of the Middle East, including northern Africa and parts of Asia. That's what he said his intended goal is, and of course to do so, the first thing he would have to strike would be northern Syria. I'm not asking you to take this on good faith from me. Listen to what the man said. Listen to some of the things that he said. Listen to the things that his advisors around him that help make decisions on these things, that they've said. Their goal is a Muslim caliphate that spans the same region that the old Ottoman Empire did back when Turkey was on top of the Muslim world. That's what they're trying to do. And of course, if they're going to do that and then the Americans pull out and there's not a force that is capable of resisting them anymore, of course they're going to strike immediately. And the fact that this has already happened is just a testament to that. Now, to the other side, I will say this. I appreciate that President Trump does want us to pull out of these overseas conflicts. I do too. I tend to be very libertarian, and my natural inclination, my natural instinct is to build up the American fortress and don't worry about the rest of the world. But that's not the world that we live in. I would love it if that's the way it was, but we do have interest over there. And it's kind of like if you put your finger in the dam. Okay, maybe it wasn't the smartest thing to put your finger in the dam because now you're stuck, but the thing is, if you pull it out, at this point, the whole thing's going to collapse. It is a lot easier to start a military conflict than it is to end one. And I know that President Trump's big thing is, well, we shouldn't be, I know he tweeted out earlier today, like, we shouldn't even be involved in the Middle East, which is also a strange thing because he's the one that oversaw the surge that defeated ISIS, and he's also the one that oversaw dropping a missile in Iraq. You remember the big thing about the Moab missile? Which, by the way, points out another fascinating contradiction. I have watched over the past couple days the coverage that the left has provided on President Trump's decision to pull out of Syria and how a lot of people on the right are upset with him, which, by the way, I count myself among those people, and they're not wrong. You've got prominent conservative voices saying that this was a bad plan, a bad move. And they should, because it was. But it's really hilarious to watch the left basically waggle their finger at President Trump for pulling out and then at the same time calling him a warmonger. See, that's the thing that's funny about President Trump. They're constantly trying to play both sides of the same coin at the same time. Because every time President Trump says virtually anything that suggests that we may get involved in some kind of military action with any country, not just in the Middle East, any other country, they're saying, oh, well, he's a warmonger, he's trying to get us into war. And then the second that he says anything that sounds like he may not be willing to go to war, they say, oh, well, he's just making America look weak. They do the same thing with North Korea. You remember that it was hilarious to watch him just go back and forth. It was like watching a tennis match. That one day the media would be coming out and talking about how he's all chummy with Kim Jong-un and he's, going to wind up in an alliance with him and that he favors North Korea and is going to let them get away with murder and never going to do anything to stop them from doing what they want to do. And then the very next day saying he's tweeted out that we're actually going into a war with North Korea. He's going to get us into a war with North Korea. You have to pick one. You can't play both sides of this argument at the same time. Either he's a warmonger or he's a pansy that doesn't want to do anything and wants to constantly pull us out of conflict. He can't be both at the same time. One of those two things is not true. Now, they could both be wrong. For example, instead of being a hawk or a dove, he could be somewhere in the middle. But they can't both be true at the same time. And when we're talking about this, it does show that the left's media, their goal is not to report the truth, nor is their goal to have troops in Syria or to have troops removed from Syria. Their only goal is make President Trump look as bad as possible. And if to reach that goal, one day they have to say that he's a warmonger and he's just hates everybody that's not an American and wants to blow them up and blow up their children one day, and then the very next day say, no, he's weak and he's showing us to be weak on the national stage and he's not willing to defend our country the next day, then they'll do it. And they've shown a willingness to do that over and over again. Now, I tend to think, and I have maintained this stance for a very long time now, because granted, early on in his presidency, I didn't know a whole lot about President Trump's personality. I was still trying to test the water. But I've maintained for a very long time now, it seems to me that though Donald Trump is willing to occasionally do some things where they would seem hawkish to the outside observer with no context, it seems to me his default position is, I don't want to get into a conflict. I think that he's actually a little bit too dovish. And remember that I'm saying this as somebody who is not an interventionalist at all. But on some things, he happens to be too dovish, and I think that the only time that he does take action, like a missile strike in Syria, like dropping a bomb in Iraq, those kinds of things, I really do think that the reason that he does that is because he has advisors around him that tell him, look, Mr. President, we don't want a conflict either. This is the only way to avoid one. I could be wrong, but I think that that's what's going on. And so I think that that's not a terrible position to take, because I think that anytime you take any kind of military action, your desire should be to not have to have military action for much longer. In other words, you're doing it not for the sake of getting it to continue, but to trying to get it to end, just like any fight. But that seems to be the only way that they can get Donald Trump to take some kind of decisive action like that. I don't know. But I will say, I think that the fact that he's a little bit unpredictable and that he doesn't flip sides every day, but that it's a little hard to get a read on him, I think that actually works in America's favor and makes our enemies a little bit more leery of what he may or may not do because they're just not sure. With Obama, they knew that he wasn't going to do anything, and that's why they walked all over him. But in this, President Trump is in many ways emulating exactly what President Obama did with Iraq about a couple of years into his presidency, which is right about the time that President Trump is in his presidency right now in his first term, a little over halfway through. And unfortunately, I'm afraid that it's going to yield very similar results. So the main thing that I would do is the most important thing that I can ask you to do. Just pray for our brothers and sisters. Pray for those Christians over there, because right now they are in a world of unpredictability. They don't know what's going to happen to them. They don't know what's going to happen to their families. They've been displaced and moved around. It's created a second refugee crisis. Mark my words, we're going to have another refugee explosion on us within the next few months unless something drastic is done. And so what I would really ask is to pray for all those displaced, but especially the Christians, because they're going to be dealt with more harshly than any other group in there. If there are Jews, they will be dealt with pretty much the same way as the Jews, but to my knowledge, there's not a whole lot of Jews left in that area anymore. There are a substantial amount, not a majority by any stretch of the imagination, but there are still a substantial amount of Christians, and the Turks would love nothing more than to wipe that population out, and to wipe out the population of any Muslims that aren't their brand of Muslim. So pray for all those involved, especially the Christians, because those are going to be the ones that are dealt with the most harshly. We'll take a quick break and we'll be back in just a moment.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out! Hey y'all, I am on I-85 heading south, coming back from the loveliest village on the plains back to Montgomery. And part of the reason that I wanted to talk about this is because I just got back from Auburn judging a parliamentary procedure contest. One of the things that it teaches young people is the art of debate. And because I was judging that and because I was thoroughly impressed with a lot of the kids that I saw today, it really made me appreciate it, made me think about what an integral part of being able to debate a topic is to a person's education. And it's the really intelligent young people that are able to engage in this contest. It's a very difficult contest. You don't even know what the subject is going to be until 1 minute before the contest starts. And so you have about 60 seconds to, in your mind, come up with 4 debates, whether this topic is a good idea or a bad idea, and you have to be able to think on your feet, and you have to be able to debate back and forth with your teammates. It's an incredibly difficult contest, even though, as a general rule, there aren't a lot of people that go through this contest that continue to use the rules of parliamentary procedure later in life. And I'm sure some do with their local churches or small organizations like that that actually use Robert's Rules of Order. Really what the contest teaches is the art of debate. You have to be able to think on your feet. You have to be able to very quickly come up with compelling arguments and to form your ideas and your thoughts about a topic into a coherent piece of thought and convey that to other people in such a way that it convinces them to side with you. And I was thinking about this, and this is a contest that you can't participate in until you get to at least the 9th grade. And it really made me sit down and think about how criminal it is that we don't teach our students debate much earlier. But there was a time where a staple of Western thought, that if you were an educated person in the West, you were started on debate at a very early age. In fact, it was not at all uncommon for somebody to be well-versed in the art of rhetoric, well-versed in the art of persuasive speech. From a very early age, it was one of the very first things that they taught. In ancient Greece, for example, going all the way back to the birth of Western civilization, they started you on that when you were about 5. They started you on geometry, of all things, and rhetoric. And the reason for that, the rationale for that, was that it was important because it taught you how to think critically. In other words, if you were involved in rhetoric and you had to learn how to put your thoughts together that quickly, and you had to challenge ideas and sometimes even take the opposite side of the position that you actually held on an issue, it taught you those really critical thinking skills. And because of that, the rest of your education was easier, because nothing teaches you a subject like having to defend it against attack, or the opposite, having to attack it and finding the places where the thinking is flawed or where the ideology needs some improvement. And so because of this, this was a staple of Western civilization really up until about 100 years ago. And it's part of the reason that the education system worked so well for so long. For the longest time, our students had to not only learn material, but had to stand up and defend it, or stand up and be critical of it. And that really helped them understand and absorb the material. And furthermore, because they started out with that first and developed their critical thinking skills, the rest of their education was more robust because they had those critical thinking skills and those problem-solving skills to begin with. So it made a real difference in our education system, and it's something that I believe is sorely lacking, something that we need to bring back. And another bit of social commentary on this is that when it comes to the stereotypical characteristics of some people in my generation and the generation after it, Generation Z, what do you typically think about? They have a hard time taking criticism. They don't like hearing ideas that are not shared by them. There are things that they say is actually violent or harmful to their health to hear ideas that they disagree with. Well, the reason that that wasn't the case for the longest part of Western civilization is because we took on the idea that you ought to have to defend your own ideas, that ideas ought to be observed critically, and that you should have to go through and test whether or not something was true or not. That's really not the way education works now. They give you facts that they say are true and then expect you to just sort of regurgitate them on the test. That's not an education. That's memorization. And there's nothing wrong with memorization. Memorization is great. I'm an advocate of it. But it's not the same as having to defend your ideas.
And welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us here on the program. Got another story for you that I think is one of the most important stories in America because it's such an appropriate, timely story. And it's not one that was planned, it was spontaneous, but I think that that's what makes it so important, so special. And it unfolded the other day on the Ellen DeGeneres show, of all places, which, as you know, if you've been watching me for any length of time, is not my regularly scheduled programming, but I came across this clip, and it's just, there's so much profound thought behind it, and it's not necessarily something that's complicated. It's actually very simple, but it's a concept that so many of us in this country have lost, and I think Ellen absolutely hits the nail on the head here. So this is from the Ellen DeGeneres show the other day.
So anyway, so we get to sit in this very fancy suite because, you know, he owns the whole place. So his suite is fancy, and he's got fancy friends. And I don't mean fancy like Real Housewife fancy. I mean like fancy. Look, I took a video of who was next to me. Yeah, fancy. But during the game, they showed a shot of George and me laughing together, and so people were upset. They thought, why is a gay Hollywood liberal sitting next to a conservative Republican president? Didn't even notice I'm holding the brand new iPhone 11. And but a lot of people were mad, and they did what people do when they're mad. They tweet, and but here's one tweet that I loved. This person says, Ellen and George Bush together makes me have faith in America again. And exactly. Here's the thing. I'm friends with George Bush. In fact, I'm friends with a lot of people who don't share the same beliefs that I have. We're all different, and I think that we've forgotten that that's okay that we're all different. For instance, I wish people wouldn't wear fur. I don't like it, but I'm friends with people who wear fur. And I'm friends with people who are furry, as a matter of fact. I have friends who should tweeze more. And I have... But just because I don't agree with someone on everything doesn't mean that I'm not going to be friends with them. When I say be kind to one another, I don't mean only the people that think the same way that you do. I mean be kind to everyone. Doesn't matter.
Now, you see the response there of the audience, and you see how they're reacting, and that's 100% appropriate. Now, full disclosure, I'm a very conservative Southern minister. I don't agree with a lot of the things that Ellen DeGeneres does. I don't like her lifestyle. I think it's wrong. I think it's sinful. And I would tell her that if she were to ask me. In fact, I've brought that up on the program before when she was in the news, I don't know, a couple of years ago for something. And she and I were definitely on opposite sides of that argument. But what she's talking about here rings true for one very, very important reason. The world needs more of this. She's right. We have gotten to the point where we absolutely will not tolerate differences of opinion. Now, tolerance isn't love. That's one of the maxims of this show, but it's also coupled with disagreement isn't hate. Yes, tolerance is not nearly as important as love. Love is the higher calling, the higher version of this. Tolerance just lets you do whatever you want. Love actually tells you when you're doing something that is wrong or self-destructive. That's the difference. That's what Christians are called to. However, that is coupled with, and this is one of the mottos of my show, that is coupled with the idea that disagreement isn't hate. That just because I don't agree with your stance on something, that doesn't mean that I have to hate you. It doesn't mean that I have to cut off all ties with you or never associate with you again. I have friends, just like most Americans, that have incredibly deep-seated disagreements with me. I've got one guy that's a full-on socialist and doesn't mind telling it to me every time he sees a political post on my page. I've got friends that are from all kinds of different spectrums, walks of life, race, sexual orientation, whatever. I disagree with almost everybody I know, at least on one topic. Obviously, there are some I agree with more than others. But the point is, you don't shy away from having a relationship with somebody because they're different. And this is something that should be abundantly clear and obvious to anybody that has studied the teachings of Jesus Christ. Because if you're looking at the life of Jesus, there were people that he disagreed with all the time. As much as he argued with the Pharisees, which is pretty often based on the very short amount of writing we have of his life recorded in the Gospels and the large portions of that small account that are him arguing with the Pharisees. I mean, I think it's safe to say that he had some pretty deep-seated disagreements with them. He didn't cut them off. He didn't stop talking to them or try to not associate with them. There are even a handful of times in the Gospels where he actually does give them compliments on certain things that they are doing correctly. And another thing about Christ's life, it was not uncommon for him to associate with people that were seen as the less desirable of society. Tax collectors, which is appropriate, they're seen as less desirable in society, and also harlots and people that would not have been viewed as clean or pure by the Jews, and rightfully so. But the point is, he didn't refuse to associate with them merely because they had disagreements with him. I mean, John 4 is a testament to that. In that time, what the Jews did, because they had a religious disagreement with the Samaritans on how to worship God, that kind of thing, they did not associate one with another. And because of that, when Jews were heading north through the northern kingdom, or what used to be the northern kingdom, when they came to Samaria, they would go around that mountain. Took them extra time, but they still did it because they did not associate with Samaritans. Jesus goes straight through the mountain, right where the Samaritans live, and the first thing that he does when he gets there, at least as far as we're given a record of, is he starts having a discussion with somebody that has had 5 husbands and is sleeping with a man that is currently not her husband. Now, he didn't say that that was okay, because again, he was about love, not tolerance. He didn't say that, oh, the lifestyle you're living is perfectly fine and I'm not going to talk to you about that. No, but he still didn't refuse to have a conversation with her. He treated her like she was important, that what she thought mattered, and he moved on from there. And he answered questions that she asked him, theological questions. I think the same thing applies right here with George W. Bush. And I'm not trying to cast one as Jesus and the other one as the woman at the well. I'm not trying to do that. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one comparison. But I'm saying the fact that two people that have deep-seated disagreements with one another can sit down and enjoy a football game is a good thing. And by the way, it's a very American idea, especially with sports. I mean, that used to be something that united us, that whether you voted Republican or Democrat, whether you agreed with the guy's politics or not, you could all sit around either at the stadium or at a sports bar or at somebody's house and hang out and talk about how your favorite team was doing that week. And that's been true of every sport. That's a uniquely American thing. And that's one of the reasons that I said back when the whole Kaepernick thing was going on, that was so poisonous to America, is because we have politicized those common areas that used to bring us together. I'm not saying that they had to be politics-free zones or anything, but merely that it poisoned the water and made it to where we couldn't even sit down and have that commonality, that common hobby anymore. And that's really the issue that we've run into. Because what you just saw there with President Bush and Ellen DeGeneres sitting next to one another, that's what America used to be and what America should be. And the way that Ellen categorized that whole thing, where she said, just be kind to people. And when I say be kind to people, I don't mean be kind to only people that you agree with. That's basically straight out of the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm not saying that that's where Ellen got it, but the idea is eternal. And it should not shock people that because it's good advice that they can both arrive at the same conclusion. That when Jesus says, be kind to one, he says, love your enemies. One of the things that he points out in bringing that teaching forward is, well, the Gentiles even love people that are good to them. It's not a credit to you if you're nice to people that are nice to you, or if you're good to people who you pretty much already agree with and are already in your tribe. That's not anything special. Everybody does that. If you want to be a truly kind person, if you want to be somebody that actually changes hearts and minds, the way to do that is to adopt that mentality. That you're kind to people that don't like you. You're kind to people that don't deserve it. That's the way to actually change somebody's heart. And the great thing, I think that the timing is just so perfect. We have become so petty as a country. There are people that are angry about this, that are upset about this, that even in the response, even after Ellen explains herself and explains why it was silly for those people to be mad, there are still people that are ticked off about that. There are still people that tried to push back against that. I don't understand people that actually desire to live in a world where they have to hate people that disagree with them, where they actually prefer a society that if you disagree with them, you're cast out and you cannot be invited back into polite society. And there's several examples of this. This is the first one, a tweet from Soldado Brian, who, by the way, works for CNN, which means her job is to pretend to be a journalist. So this is her takeaway from this. With love to Reese and Ellen, whom I don't know, people who lost loved ones in New Orleans and everywhere during Katrina because of failed response by FEMA might find this kind of answer a little pat. First of all, that's absurdly ridiculous. If you know anything about the history of what happened in Hurricane Katrina, there was a failure in government on all parts, including in FEMA, but also by the local authorities, by the mayor, by the governor, who refused to declare a state of emergency. And you also have to keep in mind that a lot of those people that, did pass away were ones that were not able to have, supplies gotten to them in time, and that was nobody's fault. That was just, there was so much debris and so much in the way that there was no way that they could get into. And another thing that you have to keep in mind, that the mayor of the city, who was black at the time, was the one that refused aid for several days. And they also knew ahead of time, long before this took place, that those levees were only built to survive a Category 3 storm. They knew it. They knew it for over 100 years and refused to fix it. So this trying to play, there's blood on George Bush's hands. There's thousands of people that died in Katrina. You can't point that finger at him alone. You just can't. And the idea that George Bush was strategically holding back aid because there were people in New Orleans that he didn't like primarily because of race is just such a patently absurd thing. And another thing, too, wouldn't that kind of prove that? I mean, this event where George Bush is laughing and cutting up with Ellen DeGeneres, a person with whom he profoundly politically disagrees with, doesn't that kind of prove that he's not a spiteful person that would go after people just because they didn't vote for him? I mean, it really is a ridiculous premise when you think about it, and this story kind of punches a hole in that theory anyway. This is another tweet by Arlene Parsa. The guy's a documentary filmmaker. So cool that Ellen has forgiven George W. Bush for trying to withhold human rights from gay people. Yeah, he literally never did that. I don't even know what he's talking about there. I'll never forgive Bush for his victims of the unqualified rich crony he appointed as the head of FEMA. Hurricane Katrina killed 2,000 mostly poor black people needlessly. So it really does baffle me that there are people that still buy into this ridiculous narrative. Anybody that's looked at the history of what happened there, The idea that George Bush was strategically holding back aid or was, trying to keep people from getting, that's so absurdly ridiculous. It's not even funny. Here's another one, Mark Ruffalo. You may know him as the Hulk from Avengers. Sorry, until George W. Bush is brought to justice for the crimes of the Iraq War, including American-led torture, Iraqi deaths, displacement, and the deep scars, emotional and otherwise, that's barely a coherent sentence, inflicted on our military that served his folly, we can't even begin to talk about kindness. Well, no, you can talk about kindness or love, but in this case, the lower version of that kindness, you can talk about that regardless of who it is. You can talk about kindness even if it is legitimately somebody who did all the crap that Mark Ruffalo is pretending that George W. Bush did. Again, the history does not support his premise. The idea that George W. Bush is some kind of war criminal is absurd. All the best intelligence agencies across the globe, America and everywhere else, really did believe that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And even when they went in, they still found facilities that created them. Didn't find the weapons themselves, but they found the facilities that were creating them. And you don't build a factory to build something unless you intend on actually building it. So I'm not saying that it was correct. We did have incomplete information, and whether or not we should have gone in at the time, I understand that that is a legitimate debate to have. But the idea that George W. Bush was knowingly doing this or it was all a farce, you have to judge somebody based on the information they had at the time. Judging them in hindsight is unfair to them. Because if you're saying that you have hindsight and you're judging them based on that standard, well, they didn't have hindsight at the time, so you can't judge them based on that standard. It's an unfair thing to do, and none of us would like for that to happen with the decisions that we've made in our own life or career. I will say it is funny, though, Mark Ruffalo apparently living up to his motto as the Hulk, that he just always stays angry. Like, this is all stuff that's been debunked years ago, and he's still angry about it, even though it's not even true. So apparently he really bought into that character of the Hulk. And this last one, Noah Michelson, this is one of the editors over at Huffington Post. Privilege is Ellen DeGeneres explaining her friendship with George W. Bush by saying, quote, just because I don't agree with someone on everything doesn't mean I'm not going to be friends with them, as if what they disagreed about is who was best dressed at the Emmys or what the best mayo is. See, that I think is the most important one, the most important of those tweets that we need to look at. Because what is the assumption there? What is he trying to say? He's saying it's okay to be friends with somebody if you disagree on something trivial. But if it's something that's serious, like gay marriage or any other issue, presumably, is what he's addressing here, well, then you can't be friends with them. You can't be friends with someone whom you have political disagreements with. No, that's not true. I mean, yes, I can obviously be friends with somebody whom I disagree with on what kind of food that I like. I would never disagree with somebody on who had the best dress at the Emmys, because I've never actually watched the Emmys and have no intention of doing so. But the point is, so that one's kind of lost on me. But when it comes to the other stuff, like, it's more important that we're able to maintain friendships and camaraderie and kindness with the people that we have deep-seated disagreements on very important things with. I mean, it's not a feather in your cap to say, you know what, we have real problems. I really, really prefer Spider-Man 2 to Spider-Man 1. I really just think that was the better film, and it's really, really hard, but, we're still friends. Well, that's not impressive. That doesn't take a lot of character. It's not a difficult thing to do. That's nothing to your credit. And so, ironically, these tweets really emphasize and show how important it is that Ellen DeGeneres took the stance that she did. How important it is that she is maintaining some level of sanity on the uber left that just wants to write people off and you can never have a relationship with these people. It really does remind me of a religious zealot with the purity test. This is another example of how the church of leftism has become a religion, and anyone that is impure or anybody that disagrees with the decrees of the church must be cast out, and you are not allowed to associate with those people. They're the bigots. they're the ones that will not tolerate any kind of dissent, anybody in their midst that even kind of disagrees with them. Because come on, let's be honest, and I even disagreed with Ellen's characterization of it. George Bush is not a conservative. He's not even close. He's a very progressive centrist. Loves some taxation, loves some spending. He's for lower taxes and lower spending maybe than some Democrats, but he's not a small government guy, not by any stretch of the imagination. And so to treat him as though he's some kind of uber conservative is ridiculous in the first place, but that kind of makes my point for me. Even somebody that isn't really all that conservative, just because he happens to be maybe slightly right of center, that is somebody that is poison. We can't associate with them. If you're his friend, you're a bad person. That's how insane the left has gone with this. They're so closed off, they're so encapsulated in their own bubble of self-reassurance and patting one another on the back that they don't want anybody that even somewhat challenges their ideas. They're the bigots. They're the ones that you even disagree with them slightly on a political issue. Nope, you must be cast out. You disagree with me on what kind of mayo is the best? Okay, I'll consider letting you in. But pretty much anything more severe than that, you're gone. I have nothing else to say to you. Well, no wonder they've turned out this way. Because they've had this mentality for years now, and that's been constantly reinforced, and so of course they don't want to hear anybody else. They think that nobody else's voice matters unless it's a voice that already agrees with pretty much everything that they agree with. That's how you wind up in that bubble. But in all of this, I think that the timing is so perfect. Because we saw essentially the same narrative much more severely play out last week. You remember that Botham Jean's brother, Jean. Sorry, it's spelled Jean, but it's pronounced Jean. So I forgot that for a second. You remember that he's somebody that had enough grace and mercy to embrace his own brother's murderer. And you're saying that it's beyond the pale to even just cut up with and laugh with somebody that disagrees with you on how much money we should spend in the government? That's your bridge too far. Well, no wonder we have the kind of vitriol that we do in the country. No wonder the political climate is as toxic as it is when you have people that believe that. And I'm not saying there aren't people on the right that are the same way. Believe me, I have people, I've got a couple people in particular in mind that if a Democrat said it, it's a lie. If a Democrat said it, then we have to discount it. If a Democrat did it, then I'm against it. Doesn't matter if I agree with it or not, it's the Democrats and they can't be trusted. That's wrong too. And what I'm calling for is for both sides to reevaluate it. And I mean, sure, adopting what Ellen was talking about, just being kind to other people, yeah, that's the bare minimum. But frankly, it's something the world needs a hefty dose of because we can't even get to the bare minimum anymore. And if we continue down this path, we will cease to be a functioning society. Another great example of this actually came from an incredibly unexpected source in Kanye West. We'll go ahead and watch this. This is Kanye West speaking to a crowd the other day.
Abraham Lincoln was the Whig Party. That's the Republican Party that freed the slaves. Yes, sir. That's the Republican Party that freed the slaves. For a year, people want to call me a coon. What? Because I chose my right. In America, we got the right? We got our own right to our own opinions, right? But Trump, somebody tell me because of my color who I'm supposed to pick as the president. Yes, sir. Trump. I ain't never made a decision only based off my color. That's a form of slavery. Mental slavery. I can't drink on the right person's out.
Now, full disclosure here, I'm not somebody that jumped on the Kanye bandwagon. I don't think that Kanye's a conservative, nor do I think he's a deep thinker. I mean, it's Kanye West. It's the guy that stormed the stage and took the mic away from Taylor Swift. And ironically, since we were just talking about this, it's the same guy that suggested that Bush was a racist because of what happened in Katrina. Remember, that started with Kanye. So, I mean, Kanye's a crazy person. I've been very open about my thoughts on Kanye and his stability when it comes to that. He's just, the guy's a loose cannon. He's the definition of a loose cannon. And I don't take any of his thoughts or political posturings all that seriously. But he did kind of hit the nail on the head there. Now, he mischaracterized the Whigs. The Whig Party actually went away, and the Republican Party cropped up in the wake of its own destruction. The Whigs and the Republicans did not get along, and eventually the Republicans did replace the Whigs, but they're not the same thing. So he has his history a little shaky on there, which, I mean, it's Kanye. I didn't really expect a robust discussion on Civil War history, but nonetheless, that's where we are. And when it comes to Kanye, a lot of the things that he's saying actually are true. And what he's saying is, if you're leaving yourself only one option to vote for, then that is a form of slavery. It's actually closer to Jim Crow. I wouldn't go quite as far as slavery. It's definitely close to Jim Crow, because remember what was going on in Jim Crow. Well, black people, you only have the option to drink out of this water fountain. Black people, you only have the option to go to this restaurant. And if you do go to this restaurant, you have to sit in this section. If you're black, you have to sit in this part of the bus. That's what was going on in Jim Crow. How is that any different than saying black people, you can only pick this political party? You can only pick candidates from this slate. You're only allowed to vote for this particular side of the ballot. The elimination of choice is a form of tyranny. That's the whole struggle between small government and big government. Small government people like me think that people should have as many choices as humanly possible, unless one of those choices inhibits somebody else from making their own choices. You know, if you kill somebody, that person can't make any more choices. Therefore, we have to stop you from doing things like that. But other than that, yes, as many choices as humanly possible. And the government shouldn't be interfering with that any more than they absolutely have to. The mantra of the Democrats now, the mantra of the big government centralized control people is, no, few options. People aren't smart enough to make their own decisions. We're going to remove the incorrect options so that you only have good options left. And usually that means they only have one option left. But the point is, what Kanye is talking about, actually, if you dig down deep enough, is actually kind of profound. Where he's talking about that being the removal of options, that is slavery. Now, people still do have the freedom to, regardless of your color, pick whichever candidate you do want. But the point is, it is sort of a self-imposed tyranny. And by the way, it's not just black people in the Democrats. I know that that's one that gets talked about a lot. I've talked about it a lot, being in a city that's 70% black. But it happens to white evangelicals too. As I've said 1,000 times, your vote only counts if people don't know where it's going. If the Republicans know, hey, he's a white evangelical, he's going to vote for whoever they put up. I mean, goodness sake, they could put up a guy that actually grabs women by the genitals and brags about it and has slept with every woman in the Western Hemisphere. And as long as he's got an R by his name, they'll elect him president. Yeah, I am talking about Trump there, but you see my point. When a party knows for a fact that your vote is going there regardless of who they nominate, they don't have to worry about you, and they don't have to worry about what you think of their candidates. They don't have to worry about your disagreements with that candidate because they know where your vote is going. It's no different here. And by selectively choosing to, granted it's better than being forced into, but basically black people choosing to only vote for one side of the ticket, only voting for people in the Democrat Party, they have effectively involved themselves in another form of slavery. It's self-imposed, so it's not nearly as tyrannical, but the point is it's still there. And what Kanye is saying is not completely off base, but listen to what was being said. You heard I had to bleep out several people. That they're saying that Kanye just saying, not saying vote for Trump. Kanye just saying, make your own choices. Don't just vote for somebody because you feel like you have to because of the color of your skin. That's what they're mad about. That's what's so insane to me. That he's not saying you have to vote for Trump. He's saying make your own choices and don't pick somebody just because of the color of your skin. That to them is the idea that's too radical, that's a bridge too far. It's absurd. And it's the same thing that we're talking about with Ellen DeGeneres. Just because you have a political disagreement with someone doesn't mean you have to hate that person. It doesn't mean you have to think they're a villain. It doesn't mean that if somebody votes a certain way that you have to cast them out from society. You can never have any association with them anymore. It really is absurd what we've done to ourselves in this country. And that's why I'd like to make this call. Go a step further than what Ellen was talking about. Kindness is great. Kindness is a Christian virtue. It's talked about in the scripture over and over again. I am pro-kindness, don't get me wrong. But her call was to be kind to people that you disagree with. I'm telling you to take the extra step and love people that you disagree with. I mean, to put it into the words of Christ, you treat them as though they were Jesus Christ himself. You treat that person as though they're important and they're special, and if you are a Christian, then you believe that's true because you believe that they are a child made in the image of God, just like you. It's a far more difficult calling. But if we did that, even if the rest of the world doesn't do it, the world will still be a better place. Even if it's a very small amount of Christians that answer this call, and there are people that do it now. The world will be a better place. And the more that can grow, the more people see that goodwill coming, the more people are going to be on board with it. Now, I really don't want to talk about this story, the next story that we've got coming up, because frankly, it just bums me out, but I feel like I have to because it's my job and also because News Radio 1440 is your official home of the Atlanta Braves, which unfortunately means you're going to have to wait until the next season to hear any games on News Radio 1440 because they have been eliminated. But perhaps, no, not even perhaps, even more depressing than the fact that we lost in Game 5 to the Cardinals is that Brian McCann has said goodbye to the game. Braves catcher Brian McCann has retired and announced in an interview after the game yesterday, this is my last season. I'm not doing it again. You know, when it comes to baseball players, and I know that sometimes it gets confusing because there's so many trades and they move around so much, and I have a hard time keeping up with it too sometimes. But with certain players, there's that jersey that you always picture them in. I mean, Derek Jeter, you picture what Derek Jeter looks like, your brain immediately goes to what he looks like in a New York Yankees jersey. That's par for the course. When it's Barry Bonds, San Francisco, he's in a Giants jersey. When you think of Nolan Ryan, he's suited up like a Texas Ranger. That's just, regardless of whether they spent even a significant amount of their career somewhere else, there is a certain jersey that you always picture that person in. And with Brian McCann, it's definitely a Braves jersey. Now, he was instrumental when it came to the Houston Astros and them winning a World Series, and it's great that McCann got to experience that. I was pulling for them, in large part because of McCann, when the Astros went to the World Series. But, you know, everybody that pictures him, at least everybody that I know, and even people from different parts of the country, if they think about Brian McCann, he's wearing that Braves logo across his chest. And a lot of that has to do with it's his hometown. He played there for a significant amount of his career. That's the place where Brian McCann belongs. I mean, to me, he's, not to the level professionally that Chipper Jones was, but it's that same kind of thing where you only see them in one jersey. And they're an institution. They're a part of that club. Now, I'm sure that he's got good friends in Houston, but I mean, Brian McCann, the guy's a Brave through and through. And I do think that it's really cool that before he retired, he got to come back to Atlanta and finish up there. That's a really cool thing that got to happen for him. And I'm going to miss him. But I'll say this before I go, because even though that does bum me out, I got to bring this up. Like, anybody that spends 15 years in the majors, that's an impressive career. Not many people get to that point. Not many people get to spend 15 years playing the game that they love. The average contract, I think, is only 5 or 6 years if you wind up making it to the majors. And so Brian McCann doing 15 is impressive no matter how you look at it. The guy's a catcher. Nobody catches for 15 years. Like, it's obviously there are people that do, but it's a really, really small amount of catchers that actually make it to that level and stay there for 15 years. So McCann, I mean, the guy's just absolutely phenomenal. I'm really going to miss him. Brian, if you're listening, thank you for making Braves country a really fun place to be. I appreciate that. I'm sure you're going to be around the clubhouse for a while now, but unfortunately, I have other Braves news, and it is the topic of today's daily dose of stupid.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
As I've already stated, today's daily dose of stupid does come to you courtesy of the Atlanta Braves. And this one really just gets under my skin, but the Braves have decided in Game 5, yes, that disaster of a game that ended their season where they were behind 10 runs in the first inning. I don't even want to relive that. But anyway, so, and by the way, I don't know if this had anything to do with it, but I kind of think that it may have. It's definitely some bad juju going on there. But they parsed down the tomahawk chop in Game 5, and the reason for that is it all started with a post-game interview with one of the Cardinals' newer relievers, Derek Golda. I believe he's a rookie this year. But anyway, so he did a post-game interview, and he said that it was, quote, disrespectful, and he felt that it was offensive to Native Americans. I believe he's actually part Cherokee, and that's the reason the Braves took this super seriously and toned it down and didn't have as many tomahawk chops in Game 5, which is absurd on a number of levels. First of all, I hate the culture that we're in right now. That we've gotten to this point that one person gets their panties in a twist, and you completely ignore the millions of loyal fans that have grown up with this, that it's been an institution in this club for a really long time. They completely ignore that. They completely ignore all of the people that have done that. They ignore the people that are Native Americans and are of Native American descent that are fans. I mean, with me, if my family tree is accurate, and I have no reason to believe that people in my family tree are lying to me, I have a significant amount of Cherokee and Shawnee in my background. And it's never offended me. Now, I don't know exactly how much I have, but I know it's more than Elizabeth Warren. I know it's more than Pocahontas, and that's not impressive. But seriously, if I'm not mistaken, I'm at least a 32nd. So, I mean, that's, something. But it really grinds my gears that they just ignore their fans, they ignore their own profits, they ignore the tradition here, all to appease somebody that one person got upset about it. That just doesn't make any sense to me. And they've said that they're now toning down the foam tomahawks. There's even some questions about whether they'll even be on sale next year. They didn't have the foam tomahawks in the seats like they did in games 1 and 2. And I'm really afraid that the Braves might completely nix the tomahawk chop. And I would hate to see that because I think that's one of the coolest traditions. I think it's actually the coolest tradition that the Atlanta Braves do. Been doing it my entire life. And one of the reasons that this is so dumb is I don't know why anybody would... It's dumb to even be offended by this. You could say, well, it's a stereotype. Well, yeah, but it's also a stereotype that the Pirates have a mascot that wears an eye patch and they have a cutlass. That's a stereotype, but that doesn't make it offensive. See, that's another thing that we've done, that when it comes to things like stereotypes, we assume that just because it's a stereotype that it's a negative thing. Not all stereotypes are bad. And not all stereotypes should be offensive, and the vast majority of stereotypes, not all of them, but the vast majority of stereotypes exist for a reason. In other words, there's at least some level of truth to them. When it comes to the Braves, obviously, Native Americans didn't tomahawk chop the way that we do, but that's what it's going on. And the same thing could be said with the Vikings or the Cavaliers or the Musketeers or the Knights. What about the Knights? Now, I just told you that at least some of my family tree consists of Native Americans, but on my father's side, the Colquitt family is actually descendant from a group of British Knights. Why is it that nobody gets offended with the Knights? They say, well, they don't have a racial identity. Yeah, they do. You don't see any African American Knights because Knights didn't live there. They're from Europe. You don't see any Hispanic Knights because there weren't Knights around that area. See, that's the thing. They're trying to make it to where there's one specific victim class, and that this is something that should be seen as offensive because it's a stereotype. Well, then why is it that teams that are called the Knights or the Vikings or all those, why is it that they're not offensive? How far do you want to take this thing? Because here's the thing. What do you notice about every group that I just rattled off? They're all warriors. You could throw the Spartans in there. I know that we're not far from Troy. You could throw the Trojans in there. But the point is, it's a tribute. They're not making fun. They're not trying to make light of being Native American. It's a tribute that a sports team wants to refer to themselves as the Braves, which, by the way, would include the insinuation that they are what? Brave, courageous. It is attributing a positive trait to Native Americans. That's why they're called that. The reason that they use that symbolism is because those were fierce warriors that they want to emulate as a sports team. That's why they made them the mascot. The same reason that, they have the goofy Viking helmets when you go to a Vikings game. It's a fierce warrior that inspires fear into the other side. Or at least it's supposed to. I know it really doesn't now because it's all cartoony and whatnot. But you know what I'm saying. That's the reason that they're the mascot in the first place. It's a tribute. It's not intended to be something that's offensive. And here's another thing that you need to remember too. Where did all of that start? Well, the tomahawk chop is actually stolen from FSU. Florida State University did it long before the Braves did. And it was one particular player, Neon, who came in and he actually sort of integrated it, former FSU player, and wound up on the Braves roster. And then they implemented the tomahawk chop from there. In fact, if you're listening in SunTrust Park to the crowd doing the tomahawk chop, that music that's playing in the background, that's the FSU marching band. That's a recording of them. So, we straight up stole it from FSU. And the reason that they do it is because there are Seminoles in the area. And the tribe is involved in that. The person that rides in before FSU games, that's an actual Seminole that engages in that. And it's a bridge to educate people about that culture. And it also puts them in a positive light, just like the Braves do. And so I do find it really absurd that nobody gets upset about the Vikings or the Knights or any of the other ones, even though they may very well have a racial identity associated with them too. Doesn't matter. It's a tribute. Learn how to take a compliment, people. It really is an outgrowth of this outrage culture where we're just constantly looking for things to be angry or offended about. And another thing that's important to remember about this, if they can do it with this, they can do it with anything. Because you could say, well, maybe we should be something that's just not offensive like the bears. Oh, what about the furries? Furries could identify as bears. What are you going to do then? My identity is not a mascot. People can get offended over anything. Just a couple weeks ago, the Bulldogs over at it wasn't a Georgia game, was it? One of the Auburn players, it was Miss State. One of the Auburn players almost ran into one of Mississippi State's Bulldogs, and PETA threw a fit. Like, you can't just kowtow to every nut job that gets offended at something you do. If you do, you're not going to be able to do anything. But what hacks me off is now ball clubs, whether you're talking about the Braves, the Indians, the Redskins, they're far more worried about being woke than being an entertainment venue, which is what they are. And another thing here, if the Braves are going to do this, they don't need to try to walk this tightrope. They don't need to try to say, well, we're still going to be the Braves, but we're going to try to be more responsible and we're going to... No, shut up. Pick one side or the other. Either you need to say, look, we're just going to continue to do the tomahawk chop. It's not offensive. You're the only one that seems to have a problem with it. We're just going to move forward with this. Go pound sand. They either need to do that, or they need to go in the exact opposite direction and say, no, we're going to just change our mascot. We're not going to be the Braves anymore. But this half-measure crap, all they're going to do is not appease the woke left and tick off the fans. This way, this is the worst of both worlds because now they've got both sides upset at them. And here's the thing. I'm pretty familiar with the Braves fan base. It's a bunch of rednecks like me. And I'm not saying that as an insult. I'm including myself in that process. I've been a lifelong Braves fan. So, do they really think that appeasing the left at the expense of their fans is a good idea? How many woke leftists actually go to Braves games? Not that many. They're not really big sports people. There might be a few. But as a general rule, the people that were offended by this, which is mostly a bunch of white liberals, not Native Americans, the people that were offended by this, they're not going to support the Braves. They're not going to go to the Braves game. All they're going to do is wind up ruining this for the dedicated fans and getting nothing out of it. But because corporations are scared to death of the leftist Twitter mob, they're going to capitulate to them, and it's a really dumb thing to do. All right, let's go to now that I've ranted on that, let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
All right, Chaplain's Report today does come from the book of Romans, chapter 12, verses 14 through 18. And when Paul's writing this, it's important to remember the context in which it's being written. So let's go ahead and read this. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not be haughty in mind, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own estimation. Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Now, there's two parts of this passage that I find incredibly significant. And a lot of it has to do with really the reason that this verse came to mind was because of the situation between Ellen and George Bush and the strong statement of unity that I think that we could all take a page out of their book and apply it to our own lives. You see, the way that this passage starts out is bless those who persecute you. Today, that may not be a strong enough statement. Because what we think of as persecution today, and I'm not saying that it's not, I'm just trying to put it into perspective. When we think about being persecuted, we're thinking about somebody, probably an atheist or some kind of secularist, that is trying to force us to bake a wedding cake for a gay couple, or is trying to tell us that we're not allowed to preach out in the streets or talk about Jesus in certain places. Is that persecution? Yes, it is. It's not the same as what was going on in the first century. It's important to remember that when this was going on, what Paul was saying is bless those who persecute you. He's talking about people that would raid your house in the middle of the night and threaten to kill your children if you did not deny Jesus Christ. That wasn't necessarily the most common practice, but it was going on during this time. And specifically with the church at Rome. This is before some of the really bad persecution, but persecution of Christians was still pretty high at this point. And so, when Paul is saying this, I think it strikes a much deeper chord if you understand the people that he was writing to when this took place. He wasn't saying people that are mean to you. He wasn't saying people who don't like you. He wasn't even saying people that might try to force you to do something that goes against your religion. He's talking about people that were literally killing their brothers and sisters. And this is the people that he recommends that they bless, that they pray for. That's a hard thing to do. And that's why I said at the end of that segment that I did a little bit earlier, that the higher calling, the more important thing is love. Kindness is important. Kindness is a good thing. Kindness is something that we as Christians are commanded to do. But the reason that love is the higher calling is that sometimes loving someone means being unkind to them. Sometimes when you really love a child, for example, the most loving thing you can do is to not be kind, to punish them, to take away something they like, or to add some kind of punishment that they dislike. When you have a friend that's involved in some kind of self-destructive behavior, it might be the kinder thing to do to not bring it up. But the loving thing to do is to try to put them back on the right path. And so, when we're talking about blessing those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. He's saying you can't wish ill will even on people that literally want to murder you. You should be praying for them. You should want good things to happen to them. And you should desire to be a blessing to them in their life. It may be one of the hardest tenets of Christianity to follow, but it's one of the most important because it's exactly what Jesus Christ did for us, which is something that Paul himself points out just a few chapters earlier in Romans 5, that it was while Jesus Christ was still our enemy that he chose to die for us. That's the kind of love that Christians are called to. And he gives some recommendations on how to do that. For those that are persecuting us or those that are evil with us, have been evil to us, the way that we do this and become a blessing to them, look what Paul says, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. So all we have to do is celebrate with them when they celebrate and mourn with them when something terrible has happened. Even if they are our enemy at the time, they'll see our true colors. Maybe they change their ways, maybe they don't. But I guarantee you it's going to make an impact on them. Even if it's not something that's lasting, it'll at least give them something to think about. It will resonate with them on some level, even if they don't realize it at the time. And furthermore, he goes down further in this and says in verses 16, be of the same mind toward one another. Do not be of a haughty mind, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own estimation. You see, the thing that can kill a relationship like this is pride. When he says associate with the lowly, he couples that with don't be arrogant and do not be wise in your own estimation. In other words, when you evangelize to somebody or you're just being kind to somebody, you don't treat them like they're less than you. Now, maybe you really do have all the answers. Maybe because you know the gospel of Christ, you are far better suited. Your station in life is far better than theirs is. But even if that's true, you don't use that as an excuse to be haughty in your own mind. You don't puff yourself up because of that. Christians aren't better than other people, but we are better off. I mean, we have the gift of eternal life through Jesus Christ, so of course we're better off. That doesn't mean we're better. And we shouldn't act like that either. I mean, for goodness sake, if Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, can approach people with humility, surely we as sinful human beings should be able to do the same. And not to look down on people or treat them as though they're less than us because they believe differently than us. See, that's the crux of what is going on here. And then he ends it up with, I think, one of the greatest passages in the entire Bible. Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. And if it is possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. You don't retaliate. When somebody strikes against you, when somebody does something evil to you, you don't retaliate and want to do the same thing back to them. You try to do what he talked about earlier in this passage, being a blessing to them. Rejoice with them when they're rejoicing. Weep with them when they're weeping. That's how to live like Christ and to treat others the way that you want to be treated. That's the way that you get to the mindset that you can say, Lord, forgive them. The way that Stephen did when he was evangelizing to the elders. That's how you get to that point. And it's not easy, but it's possible. And with God, anything is possible. And finally, be at peace with all men. The gospel, people don't want to accept it because they understand that it shows them that they're flawed, that they're vulnerable. And let's be honest, following Jesus is one of the hardest things you're ever going to do. You don't need any more roadblocks other than the ones that are already there. Living the Christian life is already incredibly hard. Don't make it harder for these people. Don't make it harder for anybody else. And one of the ways that we do that is we do our best to live in peace with them. And that way, if they do have a theological disagreement with us or a disagreement on politics or something else like that, it's not going to be a hurdle because we try to live in peace with them. We can argue with them, but you don't make it personal and you don't act like you know more than them. You see, living in peace with all men is not something that's really obtainable by a Christian. I mean, look at the life of Christ or the life of John the Baptist. As good as they were executed for their beliefs. Even though they did try to live in peace with all men, there were men that didn't want to live in peace with them. But the qualifier there is, as much as it depends on you. And I think that's one of the strongest virtues in the Christian ethic. That other people's behavior doesn't dictate what you do. That when other people are nasty to you, you don't respond in kind. When other people do evil around you, that's not a license for you to do evil yourself because everybody else was doing it. Your relationship with God is between you and Him, and your actions determine that. Your salvation is not dependent upon anybody else, be it another Christian or a priest or whoever it may be. It's all between you and God. That relationship is between the two of you, and the only mediator that you need is Jesus Christ. And because of that, your own behavior determines where that relationship goes. And that's why Paul says, as much as it depends on you, try to be at peace with all men. It's something that we'll not be able to achieve, as even Jesus Christ wasn't able to achieve it. But it doesn't mean it's not something that we have to work towards, that we're commanded to work towards. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.